Have you ever been told that ego lifting is bad and you shouldn't do it? Well, if you have, I'm going to make a case in this video why you should be ego lifting and really why ego lifting can actually be quite useful in adjusting exercises to fit our needs and to fit our goals. So first of all, when I say ego lifting, I'll get to this diagram in just a second. What I don't mean, and we're going to use the example of a dumbbell row to talk about why it's relevant. I don't mean like this thing where people are basically just jumping all over the place, doing something that is not representative of what you would imagine lifting to be. When I say ego lifting, I'm referring to like a little bit of sort of like a rhythmic tossing of weight, right? Like a little bit of, rhythm, a little bit of sort of catching and throwing, nothing extreme and nothing that would be sort of not related to the goal at all, right? So if we're doing a dumbbell row, I'm not talking about like using the legs, right, to get the weight up to a large degree. I'm not talking about like moving the spine all over the place. I'm talking about a specific sort of rhythmic tossing of the load. That's what I mean by the ego lifting. Okay. So how can ego lifting be good relative to a context? Well, let's picture a dumbbell row. Okay, and many of you, if you've done dumbbell rows, you're gonna understand everything that I'm about to say based on your own experience in terms of what you've been feeling with dumbbell rows. So what you'll notice is that the weight, right, and I'm going to draw this as a sort of dotted line in terms of what the resistance is doing in this position versus what the resistance is doing in this position. Both of these represent the line of force of the dumbbell at the bottom position when the arm is straight, and then at the top when the arm is bent. And if we basically extend these lines up through our arms here, that gives us an ability to see what is known as the relative amount of torque at either joint. You can think just simply that in this case, we're just talking about resistance. So how much resistance is imparted on the shoulder in this particular position when the arm is straight versus when the arm is bent? Well, to understand that, we basically just need to see how far is this line from the joint. And what you'll notice is if this is my imaginary shoulder joint right here, this line is basically running right through that joint. In the same way that if you're standing at the top of a barbell squat, the barbell, you can just stand there forever, right? Well, not forever, but eventually you'll probably get tired. But you're basically just able to sort of stand without loading, let's say, your quads. Why? Because the bar is stacked directly over the knee in the same way that the load is stacked directly over the joint here. Okay, so in other words, this is super, super easy. And trust me, this is a bit of a workaround here, but I promise we'll get back to the ego lifting thing. And what is this in relationship to this? Well, look at this line and just look how far is it from this joint, right? This one was basically stacked on top. There was almost no distance, but look how big this line is right here. And what that means is that this relative to the bottom is going to be really, really hard, right? A farther distance means more resistance to this particular joint here, the shoulder joint. And so the bottom is really easy in terms of how much load you can lift, and the top is really hard. And what that usually creates insofar as the appearance of an exercise is people having like a billion reps they can do at the bottom, but then getting to the top and just being like caught in their tracks. And this is a problem because we are so much stronger where this resistance is easier compared to this position. I don't know, I wouldn't feel super comfortable putting an arbitrary number on it, but we might be twice as strong in this position, at least relative to what we could move in this position compared to this one. And so this is a problem, right? Because we are underloading ourselves where we're strong and we're overloading ourselves where we're weak. And that's not necessarily to say that that can't have application, but where ego lifting and tossing comes into this is if you imagine someone sort of, again, doing a rhythmic dumbbell row where they're not quite moving really slow and controlled, but you can tell they're in control of the motion, but there's like a little bit of sort of, tossing out of the bottom, sort of almost like you're revving a lawnmower or something. And what that will do, because you are attempting to accelerate the load more rapidly, just like in any other, physical scenario in your life, when you attempt to accelerate something more quickly, the amount of force that you experience, in this case, resistance on the shoulder and on the elbow and the muscles involved, goes up. So if I attempt to, again, rev the dumbbell like I'm revving a lawnmower, right, to sort of yank it a little bit more hard, what will happen is this will go from easy to harder. Now, the top will still be proportionately harder, right, unless the weight is just, floating at that point. But what happens is because this becomes harder, this relatively becomes easier. In other words, the momentum that you generated in this bottom half will help the dumbbell to continue to move upward toward the top, in essence, alleviating some of the difficulty that you were experiencing in the top. And so what ego lifting and what this sort of rhythmic tossing and intent to maybe accelerate a little bit more quickly and to sort of catch a weight in the bottom, what this can do is it can help us actually make the exercise more uniformly challenging so that what was once easy becomes harder and what was once hard becomes a little bit easier. And again, this is just basically to attempt to create a situation where we're matching our strength with the actual resistance that we're lifting at any given point. So an example where we wouldn't necessarily have to do this, let's say, is in like the bottom of a dumbbell press. Why? Because at the bottom, the weights are at their heaviest, i.e. the equivalent of this position, and that's also where we're strongest, right? So in the typical dumbbell press, the weight is heaviest, but we're strongest, and so we can manage that heaviness to a great ability. But as we get to the top, and many of you know, well, when you get to the top of a dumbbell press, you can kind of just chill, much like you would chill in the bottom of this, or like you would chill on the top of a squat. And that's because the weight is stacked to the joints. But we're really weak in this position, and so as we get weaker, the weight is actually stacking closer to on top of our joints, in essence, meaning that we have a more uniform challenge. Bottom is harder, but we're stronger. Top is easier, but we're weaker. Okay, and I think that's a great rule of thumb to just think about this, not just in the context of a dumbbell row, but what other exercises you might actually be able to apply this logic in. So a good example might be a dumbbell lateral raise, right? Where is a dumbbell lateral raise really hard? Right here at the top where you're weakest. Where is it really easy? Right here where the weight is stacked directly below the joint. So what you can do is you can maybe toss a little bit of that, again, use that sort of controlled rhythmic ego lifting out of the bottom, and then once you get to the top, you have a little bit of assistance from that momentum that you generated, and again, proportionally in that case, the bottom position, this position becomes harder, where you are stronger and can handle it, and this position might become a little bit easier. So this sort of, my version of ego lifting can really benefit an exercise because you can take an exercise from one that really only challenges a very small portion of a range to an exercise that challenges a vast majority of the range, as you would ideally have in the context of trying to grow muscle or trying to get a muscle stronger, regardless of what muscle it happens to be. So I hope this was informative, and I hope that you can apply some controlled ego lifting to your training if you find that it helps you. And if you've never tried it before, what I would recommend is make sure that you sort of can master the controlled and the slower version of the lifts before you hop onto this kind of technique, which is a little bit more on the advanced side. But once you can start to understand this in one context, perhaps a dumbbell row is a great place to start, or a cable row or a cable pull down. Then you can maybe start to apply it to other things that potentially may be a little bit more complicated to manage.